Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this conference organized by the Vidal Sassoon Center for the Study of Anti-Semitism. Our guest this evening on my right is Professor Alain Finkielkraut. We have simultaneous interpretation from French into English for anyone who needs it. Can I please ask you to turn off your mobile or cellular phones? I'm so happy to have with us this evening someone who for a long time has quite rightly been considered to be one of the most important intellectuals in France. And I'm particularly happy that it's our center, which specializes in the study of anti-Semitism, which has the honor of receiving him and hosting him. Very happy also that the Dean of the Faculty of Letters, Professor Motzkin, who, like Alain Finkielkraut, is a philosopher, will speak in a few moments. Before I give him the floor, I feel it's my duty to speak briefly about a friend who recently passed away, who was particularly close to Alain Finkielkraut. And this, of course, is Benny Lévy. Benny Lévy, who worked closely with us something like 6 months ago when we hosted here at the Hebrew University Bernard-Henri Lévy. In his role as founder and director of the Levinas Studies Institute here in Jerusalem. And that's when we decided on the initial steps for cooperation between our two institutes. Before I met him, I had a somewhat mythical impression of this individual who was a former Maoist who had become ultra-Orthodox, a revolutionary in Paris, and subsequently someone whose steps were directed towards Jerusalem. However, as soon as I met him for the first time, I realized that over and beyond these legends and myths, this was not only a real thinker, someone who tried and even managed to produce a synthesis between Western philosophy and the Torah, but someone who was a real intellectual with the most amazing mastery of the French language, and also someone who was a really good person, and he was a real Jew of the heart. And when I met him for the first time, I said to him, a little bit as a joke, back in 1968, I was in Paris because I knew that Benny Lévy was the head of the proletariat left, and at that time I was definitely on the same wavelength as these people, and we laughed about the slogans for that period, the former 68ers, if we can put it like that. And of course, I brought up this slogan about the beach below the paving stones, the flagstones, and he immediately replied to me, underneath the paving stones of politics, you have the beach of theology. And Bernard Lévy, at least in his last few months, this former head of the ultra-left-wing movement became very skeptical in terms of that vision of the world. In fact, he rejected it. And Alain Finkielkraut said quite recently that it was something messianic as far as this man was concerned, That's true, there was something messianic about him, but there wasn't anything fanatical at all. And that's a distinction that must be made, because he adored contradictory debate. And tomorrow evening there will be one of these debates between Alain Finkielkraut and Bernard-Henri Lévy at the Gérard Bérard Center on a different topic. Today we're talking about anti-Semitism. Tomorrow we're going to talk about being Jewish. Bernard-Henri Lévy's book, to some extent his spiritual testament. Tragically, Benny is no longer with us. But I really do believe that here, with his great friend here, Alain Finkielkraut, and also tomorrow in this debate, what we will hear through the voices of his two friends, we will hear what Benny Lévy had to say. And I now give the floor to the Dean of the faculty, and then later I will introduce Alain Finkielkraut himself. Thank you. I was asked to speak in French, and I'm going to try and do so. So in advance, please do forgive me, because my thoughts may not come out quite as well as they might in my own tongue. Unfortunately, I think that it's not possible to decide to divide the questions up in this way, because I think really we have to take everything as a whole, and this is absolutely vital in a situation in which we can host Alain Finkielkraut, who's a perfect example of how a philosopher addresses the world. The question of the philosopher and the world is a more or less banal question in the French context, because there are so many philosophers there, unlike in the English-speaking world and perhaps even in our world. But this question now has become caught up in connection with this whole idea of Jewish thought and general thought. It's not just the question of Jewish world, the Jewish world and the overall world. This evening and tomorrow there's a possibility of a dialogue and reinitiating the dialogue between Jews in Israel and Jews in the diaspora, because these questions are becoming more and more important for us, and this is really becoming a new question now for us. Let me now tell you what I think about this question of the new anti-Semitism, just for 5 minutes. The question of anti-Semitism is always whether what you're saying is something new or something old. It's possible always that you may have different roots, but a similar effect. And anti-Semitism can have new causes or roots, but it can lead to the same pathology. Does the existence of the State of Israel, or is the existence of the State of Israel something that is challenged? Yes. But the question is whether the existence of the State of Israel would change anything. Today, throughout the world, Jewish communities are feeling a new kind of anti-Semitism, which is really being given new forces because of the existence of the State of Israel. Instead of protecting the Jews, Israel apparently is becoming the cause of their danger. But if the State of Israel were not there, wouldn't there be anti-Semitism? One has to realize that the existence of the State of Israel changes our evaluation of the effects, because the links between Jews and non-Jews, the relationships between the two, become relationships of power. Governments today are prepared to combat anti-Semitism where this can represent a danger to their hegemony, where anti-Semitism supports hegemony of governments, because if a non-Jewish and a non-Muslim or non-Islamic population becomes anti-Semitic, then it would be logical to think that the governments where the majority is anti-Semitic would also become anti-Semitic. The question is, what must Jewish communities do? It's clear what the role of the State of Israel would be. to keep an eye on policy, which is always a classic one for a weak one like the Savoy state before the state of Savoy became the Kingdom of Italy. There's another question which for me is even more important when it comes to anti-Semitism, and this is the question of how anti-Semitism influences the Jewish soul. Zionism was a solution to the quote-unquote emotional illness of being Jewish, because by being a Zionist, people were able to think themselves new, free people. The question is whether this fortified state isn't repeating part of the pathology of persecution. One needs more research with regard to the emotional and spiritual responses to new anti-Semitism, because the capacity of the Jews to survive and even to prosper and thrive will depend on their capacity for emotional and spiritual resilience. There are therefore two questions: our political response to new anti-Semitism and our spiritual response to the new forms of anti-Semitism. Our question is of vital importance, and I'm sure this evening I will be greatly enlightened. Thank you. I think now you'll understand why Gabi Motzkin is the Dean of the faculty. He came along with a speech in English, and he just managed to improvise and put it into French with such aplomb and such charm indeed, such charm, to put his message over in French as well. He's going to have to leave at 6 o'clock, not because he wants to, but he has the duties that go with the position of being a dean. But don't worry. It really is my very great pleasure now to introduce Alain Finkielkraut. I read his first book more than 20 years ago. It was called The Imaginary Jew. This was a kind of novel stroke essay, and it was also a reflection on the complex nature of contemporary Jewish identity. It was the story of a young man born in Paris after the Second World War, son of survivors, someone who was working on a dissertation and who carried on working on it since then, considering the Jewish condition under or in the shadow of the Shoah, with many, many insights, original insights, as far as Judaism was concerned, Jewish fate, everything that had been torn up in the Holocaust, but also the revival of political anti-Semitism in a new form, anti-Zionism. And I must say that even then I was already struck by his work, because this was a point of view which I utterly shared. That is, that anti-Zionism would be the future of anti-Semitism. And I do think that Alain Finkielkraut was one of the first people to put his finger on this trend before it actually crystallized as we can see it today. In 1982, when I was passing through Paris, I called him up, and he was kind enough to agree to meet me in a cafe in a rather nice part of Paris, and he gave me his book then, The Future of a Denial, Reflections on the Issue of Genocide, and he even autographed it for me, and I showed it to him today, because that's quite a long time ago. We haven't often met, but this was something of importance to us. And in this book, he showed how revisionism denial at that time, as early as that time, was already speaking a language that was left-wing, leftist language that was challenging the patterns of thinking, culture that are the basis of our Western style of life. And he also produced an anthology of articles this was after the Lebanese War, criticism of Israel, and he referred to a lot of topics that are very current ones. He referred to the scandal of the chosen people, the great solitude, the aloneness, the loneliness of Israeli intellectuals, the way in which the world was becoming a media event, and the Jews of the nation, and this was as early as 1983, 20 plus years ago. Alain Finkielkraut was, without doubt, more left-wing than I was. He had a French background, training was French, and my background was Anglo-Saxon more. He's a philosopher, I'm a historian. But I was amazed as to how our analyses very often closely overlapped or coincided, and all of that was 20 years ago. Alain Finkielkraut's books since then have addressed many, many issues that go further than the Jewish question, the question of Israel. He's looked at the condition of our culture in books such as The Undoing of Thinking. Perhaps we could say that here there's a certain note of historical pessimism that comes in that certain people have criticized him for. But he's always remained a public intellectual and a non-conformist intellectual, someone who has the courage to swim against the tide. Now, we see Alain Finkielkraut in his last book, which I have here, in the name of the other, Reflections on the Coming Anti-Semitism. And this looks at a new form of anti-Semitism, left-wing anti-Semitism. It's not entirely new, because there's nothing totally new in this world, but it's an anti-colonialist left. It's an otherworldly one. For someone like himself, or many of us who defend Israel, a priori, Israel is, in this view, considered to be wrong for trying to defend what cannot be defended. Last year, I invited a friend of Alain Finkielkraut to our center here, Jacques Tarnero, to present his film. And in that, you can see on the screen with what passion Alain Finkielkraut has defended Israel's cause. And there's a price for a Jewish intellectual who does this in the diaspora these days. This is a sign as to where we currently stand today. Unfortunately, 2 weeks ago, in an article in Haaretz, our own paper here in Israel, it was a pretty good article in terms of the issue of anti-Semitism in France today among the Muslims. But there, Alain Finkielkraut was called a hysteric, someone who sees anti-Semitism everywhere where it doesn't exist, despite the fact that this ridiculous and absurd charge itself contradicts exactly what this article was saying. And he's not the only one who was referred to, because in France, too, there are people, including Jews, who, as soon as the question of anti-Semitism is raised, you are considered to be an agent of Mr. Sharon, someone who wants criticism to be silenced. And this is a way of delegitimating the debate about anti-Semitism before you even open it. And this is really something of the dilemma and difficulty these days for intellectuals, for those intellectuals who want to talk about this, because this is something that has to be talked about. I don't know if we're going to talk about the Ramadan affair. Maybe Alain will enlighten us about this. Not only he, but a whole series of French Jewish intellectuals, Bernard Kouchner, Bernard-Henri Lévy, and others, are considered to be communitarian Jews, those who have abandoned or dropped universalist values, those who are Jews who are in the service of the Israeli government. It's dreadful things to say, ridiculous, but one has to bear in mind the fact that this is said, and is even said, unfortunately, here in Israel. I would like to pay tribute here to the courage of Alain Finkielkraut in doing his civic duty, really, in facing up to and facing down this politically correct dialogue that has wreaked such havoc in our culture. I'd just like to read a very short extract from his book, which I believe can be used as a jumping-off point for his lecture. You need courage to wear a kippah in those ferocious locations that are called the sensitive neighborhoods and in the Paris metro. Zionism has been considered or made something criminal by intellectuals, and to refer to the Shoah has become something impossible now. Teaching it has become impossible at the very moment that it's become mandatory. And the insult, "you dirty Jew," has appeared again in practically all schoolrooms. And Jews are very heavy-hearted, and for the first time since the war, they are frightened. Now, ladies and gentlemen, Alain Finkielkraut. Thank you very much for that introduction. I'm going to try and make you understand what worries me and the questions that I have. Is that better? Thank you very much for that introduction. I'm going to try and convey to you what worries me, the questions I have, without being hysterical, and I trust also without any pathos. I arrived in Jerusalem yesterday. I arrived at the end of the afternoon, and I was invited to dinner by friends from the Levinas Studies Center that we, in fact, set up in 2000 with Benny Lévy and Bernard-Henri Lévy. Now, the first question I was asked, I do trust this will be easier from the rostrum. I do my little best. So, as I said, I arrived in Jerusalem yesterday, and I was invited to dinner by friends from the Levinas Studies Institute, which we established in 2000 with Benny Lévy and Bernard-Henri Lévy. And when we sat down to dine, the first question I was asked was, "So, how are things in France?" I was asked this question naively, but it immediately triggered a kind of general hilarity. Hilarity with the person who'd asked the question, hilarity from myself, and also hilarity from those who were listening, because all of a sudden, the world was turned upside down. Here you have the Israelis who are used to hearing that question from anyone who comes to see them for at least the last 20 years. 20 or 30 years ago, when you came to Israel, when you went to Israel, you'd meet people who would ask you, what are you still doing in France? Why don't you come here? And then that question was replaced by daily current events that were overwhelming and painful. So the French or the Americans or whoever who came to visit their friends or family in Israel would ask, well, how are things for you? And when the Israelis asked the French, they could ask the same question, but it didn't have the same overtones. How are things meant? How are your family? How's business? How are your friends? And so on. And that was the breakdown at the time. And all of a sudden, things are coming unraveled, as if because of one's concern, you can change camps, if you like. There's a certain jubilation. Instead of us being concerned about you here, so you're concerned here about us there. After a certain while, you get a bit fed up with people being worried about you after a few weeks or months or whatever, particularly because people being concerned about you as Israelis isn't exactly the way that Israel was intended to be. The idea was, in establishing Israel, to bring about someone who would be free of Jewish pathologies, but also it would be a state in which Jews could live safely, because other states couldn't do that all the way. So for this sanctuary to become the very place of insecurity was a very painful reversal to live. And so people are saying, well, there you are, it's not like that anymore. Things are different. So perhaps in people's laughter, there was a very understandable and even legitimate feeling of perhaps historical revenge, if you like, but it's a form of revenge that can't go very far. It's not just because people are going to ask me about the more and more spectacular forms of French anti-Semitism that through intercommunicating vowels, the situation in Israel will instantly, miraculously become easier and more relaxed. But suddenly people realize that one's almost obliged, as Jews living in France and Jews living in Israel, to ask oneself the same question at the same time, albeit at the same time respecting differences in terms of danger. In France, you don't have any suicide attacks. You don't have these human bombers. Not yet, says someone in the audience. Oh, thank you very much. You can come home with me if you like. I don't have any problem with that. You know, we can make this into a family meeting. So, having clarified that point, nevertheless, all of a sudden, there's this feeling, and certainly that feeling is extended into an awareness of the link which obviously exists between what is going on in Israel and what's going on in France. There is a link. Of course there's a link. There's a connection. One can say that the rise of anti-Semitism in Europe is a spin-off from the Israeli-Palestinian problem or the Israeli-Palestinian war. The Intifada has triggered this explosion of anti-Semitism, and obviously, to start with, what we need to do in a subtle fashion, carefully, is to look at the nature of this link. We mustn't kid ourselves. There has been a risk for a long, long time that we might say, since there is a link, then any criticism of Israel involves issues of anti-Semitism. We have to think about that, and we mustn't kid ourselves. We have to start by taking seriously the arguments of the Jews in particular, some Jews in particular, who conclude from this link that there is no anti-Semitism in France. I'm referring here in particular to Theo Klein and Jean Daniel. Theo Klein was president of the CRIF, and Jean Daniel is a well-known journalist, and Theo Klein for the last 3 years constantly has been speaking from various platforms about this. Jean Daniel has just brought out a book called The Jewish Prison, and they both say, to the extent specifically that hostility against the Jews falls under, or how shall I say, is a consequence of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. This is a new hostility, and despite the temptation that we may feel, we mustn't apply this to the structure of anti-Semitism, or rather we mustn't make this fall under anti-Semitism. You certainly can't accuse Theo Klein of being a Jew who's ashamed of being a Jew. Perhaps like others, he may be a Jew who, like others, is ashamed of Israel, but that's different. Being a Jew who's ashamed of Israel is different from being a Jew who's ashamed of being Jewish. We're not going to start by putting people in the dock instantly. Let's start by looking at the values of this argument. And Jean Daniel, for his part, in his book, The Jewish Prison, really expands on this argument. He says the following: in the 20th century, anti-Semitism took an apocalyptic form, and what the Jews were reproached with was just being. They were condemned in the name of the fact that they were Jewish, and that was a terrible sentence, a terrible condemnation that led to extermination. Today, and for the first time, he says, in history, this is something entirely different. This is a policy that's being challenged. It's no longer being Jewish, but it's what the Jews do. So for the first time, the Jews have the opportunity of standing up and defending what they're doing. This is a bad method, therefore, to take this new datum and apply it to the old datum. Now, true, Jean Daniel does agree that to attack any Jew in the name of the policy which Israel is accused of pursuing is a guilty approach. Nevertheless, he says, one must not forget that at the outset there was a reaction to a real policy and not an allergy to a Jewish being that one must rid the earth of. Jews must take account of this difference, this distinction, for their own selves. They have to question the nature, the value, the legitimacy of this policy. I don't think this argument holds up. Let's say if it does hold up, it's only superficially. It only looks as if it holds up. If you take Israel's policy, Sharon's policy, then it's Sharon's policy which worldwide is triggering movements of anger, and people conclude from that if those angry movements in different diasporas target Jews, then it's a great shame. Certainly things are sliding out of control, and that should be criticized. But on the other hand, all that has to happen is for Jews to turn their back on that policy, which can be condemned and is perhaps even criminal, in order for things to go better for them. Well, you have to backtrack in order to evaluate the quality of that argument. You have to come back to the starting point. Classical anti-Semitism, or the apocalyptic anti-Semitism of the 20th century, involved a questioning of, or did it involve questioning the Jews as such and being Jewish as such? No. If the Nazis believed, and this was a real historical assignment, a mission for them, involving a kind of heroic act, the way they saw it, acting in a disinterested fashion. So if the Nazis thought that it was their duty to purge the world of Jews, that's because they thought them guilty of a monstrous policy. Their being, their Jewishness, was somehow linked up with this idea that they were manipulating, that they had a desire to dominate the world. You can't have Nazi anti-Semitism without the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, and the Protocols of the Elders of Zion mean challenging and condemning a policy supposedly pursued by the Jews. They're doing a certain thing. We have to stop them from doing that, and we have to stop them by means that are even more radical, the more radical their ends. So if you have this vision of a policy, and obviously the Jews didn't huddle in the corner to produce a conspiracy. On the other hand, you have a policy, you have a state, you have a government in Israel, and you do have a problem of the occupation of Palestinian territories by Israel. So you have an imaginary policy and you have real policy, but this real policy itself is actually the object of imagination. Or, to put things even more crudely, there's the same link between the actual existence of the Rothschilds. They were Rothschilds. Rothschilds in France, in Germany, in England. So there's the same link between existence and policy and activities of the Rothschilds. And then if you take, no, let me start again. There's the same link between the Rothschilds and the Elders of Zion and the actual policies of Sharon and the condemnation that he's the subject of. That's what one can say. So there's something in both instances, and then in both instances, this something is taken, if you like, is absorbed by some dreadful imaginary view that involves an absolute view. Modern politics involve the moment of development of something that could be called absolute. And that was my difference with regard to Beni Levi. If we take this thing that is enormous, massive, he went through his left-wing radical period, and at that time he absorbed absolute policy. It's the absolute policy that is at the very heart of our problem. What do I mean by absolute policy? It's precisely this modern idea that everything is political, and that politics have to eliminate evil. And that's a really terrifying contribution, metaphysical contribution of the modern. I'm not saying the whole of the modern era is defined by this, but modernity has led to something, with Rousseau really. Rousseau was the first person to say that all of the evil involved with man comes from oppression. Rousseau was the person who founded the idea of original goodness of man. Original goodness is something that's absolutely extraordinary. Man is naturally good, but in point of fact he isn't, because reality is historical. And in reality you have illegality, you have servitude, you have oppression. But that's the point. What a bad history has done can be corrected by a good history. And therefore it's up to politics in history and up to history and politics to eliminate evil, because all of evil comes out of oppression. What did Rousseau say? He said, I see servitude as the source of all the evils of the human condition. So do away with oppression, with servitude. And this topic of absolute politics will actually penetrate the 19th century and then will develop monstrously, I would put it this way, in the 20th. And one can say to develop in a monstrous fashion, that means in a totalitarian fashion. Totalitarianism came out of the idea that politics can do everything. Anti-totalitarianism, what is great about it, was to burst the bubble of this hubris, to cut it down to size, to reduce and cut back what had made politics into the theatre of a confrontation of a totally manichaeistic fashion between good and evil. I'd just like to quote Socialist in here, Gulag Archipelago. This is a text which had a really decisive effect and impact in Europe. It opened people's eyes. It opened the eyes of West Europeans to the real nature of totalitarianism. But if they read it properly, it should have opened their eyes in two ways. First of all, by showing the Gulag, the historian, the archivist of the concentration camps, this major phenomenon of the 20th century, the Russian concentration camps. There was something else in this book, something that was really very surprising, very paradoxical, because the concentration camp is the place of extremism. It's the place of manichaeism par excellence, where the innocent persons have been overtaken by evil, and you want to say this is absolute evil. And what does Solzhenitsyn say? He says that when you close this book at the end of the first volume, that you have to be careful not to make a political charge. He says, I'm not going to say there's evil on one side and good on the other, and in order to get out of this, you have to eliminate the evil I've shown you, because he says evil and good, everyone has both within their own heart. And so it's like tearing out part of your own heart. In other words, at the very heart of the experience of evil, the historical experience of evil, he refuses to say that evil is a historical problem. That's really the whole lesson. That's the point of the lesson of anti-totalitarianism. It's a lesson that hasn't been heard, and we're paying the price for it today. It hasn't been heard precisely because the disappearance of communism in Europe led to, or signed the end of anti-communitarism and so on. It's as if it had never existed. What did exist in the eyes of a whole vast amount of the European left was American power, precisely because that power no longer had any rivals, any foes, any enemies. It reigned alone. And then for this sole superpower, the term was developed by the French of hyperpower, a power that can do everything, an omnipotent power with a few allies, and it gets together with its friends in these closed fora in Davos or wherever, and in those closed forums, some people thought that what they saw there was the very place of this malevolent power. The spirit of the protocols was had to some extent been reanimated by this image of an American hyperpower. And this sneaky return of absolute power, notwithstanding the experience of totalitarianism, a sneaky return of this superpower, with obviously a very special place given to Israel. In your introduction, you refer to Tariq Ramadan. Now, Tariq Ramadan is an Islamist intellectual. He's an Islamist intellectual who defends the cause of Islam, and a few weeks ago, in October, he published on the internet site of the European Social Forum. It was a very virulent article. What is the European Socialist Forum? It's one of the spaces or areas created by the movement of other globalization. It's a very interesting movement, because in what's called other globalization, it's a liberal idea. You have globalization on the one side producing oppression, and then you have the other globalization in the Rousseauist sense, saying we identify evil, then we eliminate it, and then we can link up with utopia again, with a form of human development that will be wonderful, that we can get to by doing away with this approach to politics. And Tariq Ramadan published an article here where he draws up a list of Jews who are accused of communitarianism. Now I'm on the list, and I was actually very honored because my photo appeared there as a kind of illustration to the article. I apparently, in that sense, am the incarnation, embodiment of this communitarianism, intellectuals who are saying they have dropped their concern for the universal, and instead they are putting themselves at the disposal of Sharon's criminal policy. So there I am on the list, but that wasn't the worst thing. It was a list which was fairly worrying, of course, and it was a mendacious list. It was a lying list, because those of us who support Israel can sometimes criticize Sharon's policy. In fact, a few weeks after the article, Ramadan's article, Bernard-Henri Lévy and I myself went to Geneva in order to provide support in an effective fashion to that initiative, where some of it I could criticize, but overall I consider very positive. So it's all very wrong, all this. But what I think is even more wrong is to explain that André Glucksmann was using what he wrote, or was putting his pen in the service of Israel. He never refers to it. And Tariq Ramadan, in his article, said André Glucksmann has just published a book called West versus West about the Iraq War. He never refers to Israel, and his silence speaks volumes. You see, so-called psychoanalysis that has spread through our society. When you say something, well, then you are confessing, but when you say the opposite, then you're confessing as well. Ideological systems are therefore always relaxed about this. But the worst thing wasn't that aspect. This was very unpleasant, of course, but there was another paragraph, the second paragraph. And that really takes us to the very heart of this flare-up of absolute policy. And this second paragraph was about the war in Iraq. And it said the war in Iraq had been basically designed by Paul Wolfowitz, who is a well-known or notorious Zionist. And he said, not only were we as French intellectuals serving Israel policy, but that Israel's policy was ruling the world, and that Sharon pulled the strings. There was a period where progressive criticism of Israel involved saying that Israel is a bridgehead of America in the Middle East. Today, the neo-progressive criticism of Israel says it's the White House which is the bridgehead of the Israeli government. And that's how things stand now. So we have absolute politics returning. You have this vision of an American Zionist malevolent policy. And that is the reason why it's not possible to accept this dichotomy that Jean Daniel puts forward and applies. We thought that this world was developing where people wanted to kill Jews yesterday. It's also in the name of what is said, well, what they are said to be doing, that today the Jews are being stigmatized today, and there are just as many links between genuine Judaism and genuine Zionism, and the errors or crimes that the Jews are said to have be pursuing, as there are with regard to the protocols, or the protocols of the Elders of Zion and the Rothschild. But we're in a different situation, and this is the difference that we must stress. We, Jews, are victims or the target of this flare-up of, or this return of absolute politics, but this contemporary form of absolute politics has nothing, in fact, at all to do with Nazi anti-Semitism. Rather, what it does, it becomes drunk on memory. It is fed on memory, and its hubris is really based on this hubris of Nazism. Hitlerism is not Nazi, if you like. It's obsessionally anti-Nazi. There is a fascination in our part of the world, a negative fascination in Nazism, major fascination, precisely because Nazism provides a kind of framework, and one which wasn't ever hoped for, with regard to this vertiginous absolute approach. Hitler certainly was evil, and this evil spread everywhere. If you want to take this policy and apply this in the same fashion, this antithesis between good and evil, so you go look for Hitler everywhere, and the Jews are always compared with Nazis. In order to reply to this question, we have, for a moment, to come back to Tariq Ramadan. So he published this text on the internet site of the European Social Forum. Some people are more struck by the length of the list than the follow-up, but they're even more struck by the list because a few years earlier, another political figure drew up a list of Jewish journalists, and he was roundly condemned by everybody, and that was the president of the National Front, Le Pen. And he picked out a number of French journalists without saying that they were Jewish, but they were all Jews. And everybody got up in arms, was up in arms, and they said, well, oh, you can't treat these things differently. You can't say when it's Le Pen we get upset, but it's all right when it's a Ramadan. But that's the situation that we're living in. The people who got worked up were really a fairly small minority, and the European Social Forum, the otherworlders, went actually over to Ramadan against his targets. It was Ramadan who was picked, and he was picked out in a very solemn and spectacular fashion. And he made a royal entrance into the European Social Forum. He received a welcome that was worthy of this world, this other world. To symbolize this welcome, this reception, or to incarnate his apotheosis, when he got to the rostrum, he greeted the other speakers because precisely like all the other stars, he arrived a little late. So he greeted them, and the person presiding the session, no other than José Bové, didn't just shake hands, he kissed him on the cheek. That was the kiss of the era, the historical kiss, or perhaps the historic kiss of the coming anti-Semitism. José Bové and Tariq Ramadan, this apotheosis, as the Le Monde said a few days later. And because he was the victim of a campaign of denigration, José Bové had to defend him. José Bové said that, and he was even more tempted to defend Tariq Ramadan because he himself had been the subject of such a campaign when he thought that he could suggest that the anti-Jewish attacks in France might be the work of the Mossad, and real hubris of absolute politics. You see, you have an evil, and the Zionists embody this evil, and they're everywhere. So, because, well, let's say it's them who are interested in making people believe that there is anti-Semitism in France, precisely because the fear of anti-Semitism can be used to justify Israel's aggressive policy, and a dominating policy, precisely because the Israelis are closely associated with American policy and with America's war against terrorism. So that's where we are, this kiss of death, therefore, of our programmed death between José Bové and Tariq Ramadan, between conquering victorious Islam and the neo-progressives embodying the return of absolute politics. So we have to say, yes, anti-Semitism is back in France. But what does that mean? Because you really don't need me in order to put into words something that's become utterly trivial, really banal. Anti-Semitism is back in France. Many people have thought, and that it certainly includes the Americans, that this return of anti-Semitism in France is nothing other than a resurgence of French anti-Semitism. Return of French anti-Semitism is a flare-up of what we've had in the past. Well, you have to be aware of the fact that America has come out of Europe, but basically America really arose out of a disagreement with Europe. People ran away from Europe because of the Ancien Régime, of the prejudices, the obscurantists, in order to create a new democratic, i.e. egalitarian world. So America, when it comes to its relationship with Europe, has really an attitude of mistrusting it. It's never surprised to see anti-Semitism prevail in a country or in an area, in a region, in a continent, which is really marked by its history, the very history from which America really wanted to pull itself away. And America's never surprised if Europe goes back into its old ways. America almost expects that. Unfortunately, this is not what has happened. That is not what's happening today under our very eyes. The anti-Semitism that is prevalent in Europe and certainly in France has nothing at all to do with the French anti-Semitism as Barrès or Maurras or other individuals may have embodied it. This is not an anti-racism defending French identity. What it is an anti-Semitism. It's not, that's what I meant to say, it's not an anti-Semitism that's defending French identity. Rather, this is an anti-Semitism on behalf of the oppressed. This is not a racist anti-Semitism. What it is an anti-racist anti-Semitism. The Jews today are not accused of being a race. Rather, what they're accused of being, as has been shown by the Durban conference, they're being accused of being almost exclusively racist. If there is anti-Semitism, it's not a question of defending an identity. It's humanity that people are claiming to be defending. This mankind, the humanity of those who are exploited, who are excluded, who are suffering, who are oppressed. That is the humanity who are being supposedly defended in the teeth of American policy, in the teeth of Israel, in the teeth of Jews who are defending Israel, and I would also say in the teeth of France. When France seems, as it were, specifically to be hanging on for dear life to its identity refusing to give in to the claims of those who are the damned of the earth, who the excluded, the oppressed, then the same ones who rise up in protest against Israel and against the Jews rise up in protest against France. Anti-Semitists, anti-racists, and even anti-French. A very recent episode proves this. This episode is the slow working out in France of a law on secularism. You've been present, you've seen how things have developed here. A great deal of time has been taken here. This is part of an old French tradition. This is a French way of setting foot in the modern age, a French form of secularization, and it reminds us that French Catholicism, the French Church, was the first target of this secularism, above all insofar as it paid great attention, this law, this bill, this dialogue about the law. This did not single out Islam. It's not a question of militant Islamism. So the Islamic scarf is one of the standards of this. This is a problem that has to be settled without stigmatizing Islam. Therefore, all forms of all the religious symbols, insignia, a large crucifix or a kippah or the Islamic scarf at school will be banned. And the opponents weren't prepared to listen at all here. And this is a little bit like the same game that I was condemning earlier. If the law had prohibited the wearing of Islamic scarves at school, then there would have been an outcry. The Muslims are being stigmatized, singled out, it's racist. But the opposite is said. So what do the opponents and the contractors say? Exactly the same thing. They say, you're doing the opposite, but no one is going to be fooled. You're doing the opposite. But in point of fact, since there is a problem of Islamic scarves in France, it's the Muslims that you're targeting, and France is therefore going back to its history, its values, its traditions, and trying to drive Islam away. So what you have here, you have the same people who are denouncing both Israel's policies and the Jews who are accused of Zionism. Those same people are denouncing denouncing France precisely when France wants to draw on its own traditions in order to some extent to enable it to continue its own history. What I mean, therefore, is that in this other world tradition, a different view of hospitality can be seen. It's an idea that the Jews aren't used to. It's an idea that takes them in a different way. The Jews were more or less welcomed by France, but the approach, the idea or the proposal was France can become your mother country. This country can accept you. This history is something that you can assume and continue. Another idea of hospitality is now coming out, not to offer something, but on the contrary, not a policy of giving, but a policy of recognition. This is no longer, from the point of view of those who are condemning the exclusion of the Islamic scarf, it's no longer a question of saying we wish to assimilate the Muslims into France. No, it's a question of saying the Muslims have their place as such in France, whose destiny is to dissolve as a nation and then open itself up again as a multicultural society. And that's the plan that's at work in this criticism of the law on secularism. Everything involving national issues in France has to be condemned as the dregs of a past era, of a bad era. Now, when it comes to the Jews attempted to act in a totally different fashion and say, well, here we have French anti-Semitism being resurgent. The old French ideologies are coming back, but it's not true. The Jews who were able to have a place in France as France are risking no longer having a place in France as a multicultural society. And that's exactly what the discussions about this bill on secularism are saying. And the Le Monde newspaper played a very virulent, or adopted a very virulent position against this law, has acknowledged that the President of the Republic himself was extremely impressed by a book that came out last year called The Lost Territories of the Republic. This is a book by Emmanuel Brenner. He teaches French at various colleges and high schools, grammar schools, and he shows things in a very painful fashion. He shows the rise of a Muslim anti-Semitism in France. Now, what Le Monde has done, instead of crediting Chirac, the president, with his views here, continues to criticize him, saying that the law proposed by the President of the Republic has the intrinsic drawback of once again excluding and pointing a vengeful finger at Islam. So again, instead of participating racism and slowing down the implementation of this policy of recognition that is needed by France. And that's what's utterly paradoxical. In the framework of a policy of recognition, the Jews have no place, they're not recognized. This then is the finding that I would conclude with now, and I would just add the following in order to finish. Hannah Arendt said, when I'm attacked as a Jew, I reply as a Jew. I'm not going to refer to an idea that has become utterly imaginary of humanity. And I was so pleased to read what Hannah Arendt said here, and I said, I'll do the same thing. But the problem is that the Jews are not being attacked as Jews. They're being attacked as racists. They're being attacked as Nazis. They're being attacked as such. And they can't reply to that. And that's also why they are heavy-hearted. They're heavy-hearted also because anti-Semitism is becoming physical, but also they're heavy-hearted because they realize very clearly that what's going on, that there is this absorption of anti-Semitism by the discourse of anti-racism. And that's precisely why very often they no longer reply. They step aside and they meet among themselves. Ramadan refers to communitarism, but really we should refer to major distress. Thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank Alain Finkielkraut for a remarkable presentation. We see this combination of subtlety and depth in his analysis and a real cri de coeur at the same time, a cry from the heart. I really think this is a genuine intellectual passion that we've seen here that lends so much force to his presentation. I just want to give him a moment to catch his breath before I take questions, because we do have enough time to have a discussion about what he said. But I'd just like to give you a few very quick thoughts about what we've just heard. The most striking thing, as far as I was concerned, in his presentation is the fact that the new anti-Semites, to some extent, have severed the links with classical anti-Semitism and, above all, with racist and Nazi anti-Semitism, as Alain Finkielkraut has said, this is a really manipulation of anti-Nazism, of anti-fascism, and in a rather perverse but also frightening fashion, this is now being turned against Israel, which is becoming the very incarnation of all the horrors of the past. In his book, for example, he said that the new anti-Semites are saying no to war, no to racism, no to nationalism, no to great power politics. These are persons who are speaking in the name of anti-racist and democratic values, and today they're accusing the Jewish people, the first victim and target of all these horrors, of in fact being the main representative of these scourges. So the question that arises here is how, intellectually speaking, and I'm not asking for a political and strategic program, but how we can confront this type of charge, because it's at the same time very difficult emotionally, but also intellectually speaking, to deal with this. And then I have another question that I need to ask. We haven't so much heard thoughts about this evening, but very often defending people who are in the front line of accusers, what we find is what they're doing is simply a manifestation of solidarity with the Palestinian cause. I wonder how in France and in Europe, generally speaking, it's possible to reply to this kind of thought or argument. And then for France, I wonder whether perhaps there isn't, nevertheless, a link between a certain pro-Arab policy on the part of France that has been there since General de Gaulle, which has created a certain atmosphere, particularly among political elites and the media, and what we're seeing today, a process of evaluation. Or is it really something different, something separate? And then my last thought, which I was struck by after reading the book, and this involves a certain paradox involving the Jewish mind, the Jewish spirit. And somewhere you say that today the territorial and national manifestation of Jewish experience, the Jewish state, the nation state, not only is not being outstripped, but it represents all the horrors of the European colonial past, but also cosmopolitan Jews, international Jews, the rootless Jews, those who say that they are above the outmoded ideas of territorial sovereignty. Those are the ones who are admired and welcome and praised, and who also in the front ranks, the front rows of those who are attacking the Jewish state and denouncing anti-Semitism, and denouncing racism. And that's a paradox, because at one point we thought that the Zionist state had overcome this very old debate, which is now outmoded among Jews. But now we see this return almost in triumph, a triumphal return almost, of the internationalist Jew. And I'd be very happy to hear your thoughts on this. So I'll leave you a little bit of time to think about that, and then in 5 minutes we'll kick off the discussion, because we have a lot of time. Can I remain here? Is that all right? That suits you? Fine. Thank you very much. What was the first question? The first one? Oh, yes. It's true, it was implicit in what I said, but it's always better to take what hasn't been said and say it explicitly. The violence directed against the Jews is always presented as involving solidarity with the Palestinian cause, and indeed it draws on the images of the Intifada. This is very obvious in the French neighborhoods. Everyone has a satellite dish. People watch broadcasts from the Arab world, and people watched one after the other the report of the death of little Mohammed Dora. And it's this sort of report that nurtures hatred, and the idea that the situation in the suburbs, in the neighborhoods, is comparable to the Intifada. But here again you see that the climate is at one and the same time anti-French and anti-Semitic. French Jews are being attacked because they're supposed to be guilty of solidarity with this policy and these images of what is said to be criminal, and people attack images of the Republic because the hottest heads in the suburbs, in the neighborhoods, in the sensitive housing developments take the facts of or what is shown of the occupation and imposes that on realities of life in France. And all of that leads to support for the Palestinian cause. The French Jewish Students' Union has come up with a response a few months ago. It organized a meeting in Paris with slogans saying, I'm a Zionist and pro-Palestinian. And this was a very smart idea. It wasn't just a tactical one. After all, Shlomo Avineri has made the point very, very well. In Israel, everyone, or practically everyone, there's an enormous majority of people who think that there is a national conflict. Now, some people conclude, well, not everyone who thinks that draws the same conclusion. Some say the Palestinians have to have a viable state, and the viable state presupposes the withdrawal of all or part of the settlements. There's a more or less large withdrawal to the 67 borders with certain swaps, the Geneva Plan, Sabre and so on. Others say, no, there's too much. Our security requires us to give less. But what has to be given back will be given back to Palestinians who as a nation have to have their state. So there was nothing extravagant and overblown in strategic terms, neither for the Zionists, the members of the French Jewish Students' Union, in saying we're Zionists and we're pro-Palestinian. What was striking was the degree of solidarity with the Palestinians. Today, even more than yesterday, people say that Zionism was a blind movement. It said that the slogan that would sum up Zionism would be a people without land for a land without people. Unfortunately, there was a people there and they had to be got rid of, people say. Well, obviously the reality is far more subtle than that and very different. And today we can say it's the opposite. We can say that as far as the Zionists are concerned, Israel is whether they live in Israel or not, that most people say we know there are two nations. As far as the Palestinians are concerned, a majority of Palestinians say there is a Palestinian people and there's a colonial power. So the country without people is Israel. They just say these are people who, in the name of an invented nationalism, colonized a country. And that's the response. That's the first response to be given, to say that it's perfectly logical to be Zionist and pro-Palestinian, but in return, solidarity with the Palestinian cause today involves obliterating Israel as a historical mistake, and we've been given proof of this. I could have talked about this in my presentation, but I didn't want to go on for too long. I saw people looking at their watches, and it's always a little tricky when that happens. But to be perfectly serious, there was a frightening movement for all of us, and for you, even more, you Israelis, even more than for us as diaspora Jews, but it was the attitude of Iran after the earthquake in Bam. Bam was a city that was just wiped off the face of the earth. All of mankind was mobilized. There was this feeling of pity, which is the democratic human feeling par excellence. There are differences, there are friends, there are enemies, there are conflicts, there's a plurality of cultures of this, that, and the other, but there is a human universality which is tested in pity. And they said, well, we will have a suspension of conflict, pluralism. We're not going to put an end to it, but we'll suspend it in order to apply universal solidarity. But Israel is excluded from universal solidarity at the very point that the Israelis, really totally overwhelmed by these images, wanted to apply, to show not just pity, but also provide their good offices, just as Turkey had already benefited. And this is really, we felt totally stabbed in the heart. And it was noted not as something awful, but just as something worth looking at. And just a little footnote, one day it was noted and the next day it was ignored. The Libération said the world at the bedside of Israel, but Israel was excluded from the world. Why Israel? It's not Sharon's policy. This is exactly where you can see the current madness of anti-Zionism. And this is exactly where you can say solidarity with the Palestinian cause must not and cannot go this far. However much one is in favor, and precisely because one's in favor of the end of the occupation, in other words, the Palestinian state side by side with Israel, precisely because what we're talking about is that the Iranians said we don't want any help from the Israeli regime. It's not the Israeli government, it's the regime. Say, Amos Oz, talking about the Geneva Accords, he said Zionism is not a first name, it's a family name, a surname, and they said the whole family is guilty. Sharon, Begin, Barak, Begin, Netanyahu, they're all the same. They are embodiments of a guilty regime, and you have to go further than that. Yes, the Iranian regime, you're right. The Iranian authorities. I would like there to be demonstrations in the Iranian streets against this. And above all, I'd like the Nobel Prize winners who are against the Islamic scarf in Iran and in favor of an Islamic scarf in France to intervene here, representing enlightened Iran with this measure. But one cannot speak on behalf of the Iranians. You see, that's something we do as well. We make this distinction between, not just between the government and the regime, but between the regime and the authorities and the population. When they said there's the regime, which is the form, but the nation is matter. They said the regime deserves to be given more consideration than the cities and so on. But if you talk about the Israeli regime, then the nation, the regime, and the government are all denounced as a evil entity. The Zionist regime is the Israeli nation itself, and the condemnation of the Zionist regime is translated by wiping Israel off the map. Hence, there's something here, there's an exterminating radicality in this solidarity with the Palestinian cause, which has nothing at all to do with the national claims and demands of the Palestinians, and it's very possible and indeed very possibly very necessary to introduce this distinction, to criticize this solidarity in the name of a national claim which we cannot utterly, we're not in a position to delegitimate. And then, a question from the floor? A question without a microphone can't be interpreted because it cannot be heard clearly. I wouldn't put things that way. What I was challenging wasn't the political vision of the world, but rather this absolute policy which seems to me to be coming about again against Israel, or to put it differently in a more abrupt fashion, when the thought of conspiracy takes over people, then Israel is in danger, comes out of the third world. You're talking about an evil here, and the idea is to say who's responsible for the evil and do away with the person responsible, and then you do away with the evil. That's the way these people think. If Israel is considered to be guilty of conspiracy, then you have to be merciless. You have to say, no, this is not true. We have to know that we live in a world of relative policies, in the world of nations, where people make mistakes, where nothing is perfect, where people do get things wrong. And Israel have to be able to do things that they have to be able to talk about. I have a weekly broadcast on Jewish radio. I was really surprised myself. That isn't the sort of thing I saw myself doing. But this is because of the new situation that we're in. I need to be with my own in order to talk in without worrying about what people are going to think. But that doesn't mean to say that you don't pull any punches. You have to be able to talk about things honestly. We talk about this phenomenon of the coming anti-Semitism, and at the same time, you have this feeling you want to repatriate, if you like, what some people want to place. How would I put this? What some people want to, or what some people consider to be a form of absolute policy, to repatriate or to bring them back to the area of relative policy in politics. It means questioning what Israel is doing, what it should do, and it means that when you feel involved, you should be able to intervene. I don't think it means setting fire to your neighbor's house. I certainly don't think that we should allow those who keep repeating, you are only talking to us about anti-Semitism because you are refusing anyone the right to criticize Sharon. Well, that's not true. We have to say two things. There can be an anti-Semitic criticism of Sharon that exists in France, and that certainly does exist in some of the media, particularly one called Télérama, which is a television magazine. It's a cultural one, and it says people can say it's just minor, but it's frightening. It's fanatical. It tells the Jews, well, for a Jew who has a little bit of an ear, it's that magazine, this is the magazine of the oppressed. This is the magazine that says to the Jews week after week, go away, leave. We don't want you here. When people say anti-Semitism doesn't exist because you don't like Arabs, because you're racist, because you don't want us to criticize Sharon, we can say, yes, certainly there is criticism justified of Sharon, but it's not because this anti-Semitic criticism has swept over the world that you cannot criticize Israeli policy. The demonization of Israel has to be combated, but it has to be combated in the name of returning to normal political analysis and discussion. In other words, a relative policy, not an absolute one. What must be done, what should be done, what are the Israelis doing today? And it seems to me, if you like, that if that attitude, that's an attitude that remains absolutely necessary in France and in Israel. I just take 3 questions. If you could come up to the microphone, please. It's necessary for the interpreters so they can hear. Louder, please. You've written and said quite rightly that anti-Semitism crystallized in Durban. Don't you think that in Geneva, anti-Semitism was watered down because some Jews came along and criticized Israeli democracy? Why are you brave and not timorous? Why do certain French intellectuals not sometimes defend Sharon instead of sometimes trying to justify the fact that they're not with Sharon? It's a shame that you've asked me this question after what I've just said. I have 2 questions I want to ask, but first of all, I want to clarify something, and I assume everyone will agree with it. This is not an Israeli political meeting, and if people have criticism of Israeli politics, this is not the subject. It's not the subject of this evening's meeting. I have 2 questions I would like to ask, and I make this point. This is not the issue today. There are many issues to do with Israeli politics, but it's not the time and the place for this. I have 2 questions. Which put forward anti-Semitism from 2 different points of view, the Jewish reaction. In The Imaginary Jew, in your book, which you published 20 or so years ago, you've described the new French Jew who came out of France after the Second World War, after the 6-Day War, who broke the continuity. The Jew was turned into a Jew who was affirmative, if you like, a new Jew, a pride Jew. Now I hear you talking about the distress of the Jews of France. My question, therefore, is what has happened to the new Jew? Or perhaps the new Jew was an illusion. Perhaps the new Jew is a repetitive phenomenon in the diasporas. In other words, where there's not too much anti-Semitism, or when things are going too bad, where you have the feeling that a new Jew is coming out until the next crisis comes, until the next anti-Semitism arises. In other words, then the Jew is in distress again, then you don't talk about the new Jew anymore. And then the second question I want to ask you is this. I'm sure you're familiar with the motto, the slogan, used during the large-scale demo on the 2nd of April 2002. And they said, synagogues burnt, France in danger. There are 2 ways of responding. People can say, well, synagogue burned and Republic in danger, or people say synagogues burnt, synagogue means synagogues burned. In other words, Jews don't have to depend on what everybody else thinks. There are 2 ways of thinking. I'd like to know what your response is here. I will reply to these 2 questions and also the previous question. Nevertheless, although I entirely share your concern that we shouldn't turn this discussion into a Israeli party political meeting, but everything is, of course, tied up and interconnected. Rousseau said that as soon as someone says, I don't really care about matters of state, then really democracy is over. and that means that democracy works as a result of representation. Oh, dear. Okay, let me repeat. I'm quoting also, as soon as someone says that I really don't care about state matters, then we have to say the state is lost. I don't think that this phrase has lost anything of its relevance. If it's true that our democracies are representative, there are delegates, there are delegates, representatives, they're elected, that doesn't authorize citizens who have been involved in these elections to say, well, I don't give a damn, insofar as they do not have to place blind trust in their representative. Democracy, what is democracy? It's precisely the fact that what it does, it introduces a kind of balance with regard to its own institution, the modern liberal state, and that's precisely why Levinas saw this as having a kind of superior value. The liberal modern state is the state of perpetual lack of completion. There are institutions and there's something else. There is room for voices, and those voices which have heard, at no point ever said, we are coming in instead of policy, we're going to do things instead of politicians, and therefore they are utterly irrelevant. What they did was to say, we are the patriots of a camp, there are the patriots of another camp, and for 3 years we've been negotiating, and these have been very tough negotiations. We're on the edge of breaking things off. That's where we've got to, and this is what we're saying to the world. This is what we're saying to our peoples, and it's our peoples who will do with this what they see fit. If we send this Geneva plan off to all Israelis with a preface by David Grossman, we didn't say these are the people who are going to eat you up because we've taken power. We don't have the slightest indication of a coup whatsoever. They said, if we think that if we are to have a solution, we think it will be like this. Maybe there won't be a solution at all, because nowhere does it say, unlike what modernity says, that all problems have, or all situations have solutions. No, we could live as we are now for 50 or 100 years. But they say, if there is to be a solution, we think it will be like this. But maybe there are several reasons for why there wouldn't be a solution. It may be because there really isn't a partner. So people say, well, if there's no partner, then what are you going to do? You're going to continue like this in a Jewish state with 20% Jews and 80% Muslims in 80 years. Will that be a nice form of Judaism that people will enjoy? No, we know that that's not the case. We know that it's a cul-de-sac, that there's no way out here. But we know precisely why was there this Geneva plan. Because no alternative has been presented other than to perpetuate a painful status quo, which is painful for everybody. You can criticize the lack of realism of the Geneva plan. You can say that it's gone too far in its concessions, and in that way it has condemned itself to remaining a minority phenomenon in Israel, but to consider it anti-democratic, saying that it's citizens and political leaders who are not in charge of matters, who've negotiated this among themselves. This is to have an idea of democracy which is extraordinarily restrictive. And in addition, I have to say that I met David Grossman a few months ago on an earlier trip of mine, because it was also one of the odd things about the link with Benny Levy. Benny Levy, for a good number of years, had been my link with Israel. Benny Levy didn't like the illusions of Oslo. He didn't like the way things were going, and neither did I. But that's why on my trips I met a number of people, including David Grossman, whom he quoted in his last book, not about Geneva, not about politics, but about the misery of Jewish destiny, which is affecting Israelis themselves. So I did have that meeting, and I was very impressed by and very struck by this meeting with David Grossman. I thought he was very genuine. He said that there were these negotiations at the time. He asked me not to talk about it. I didn't. And he said, I'm not pessimist, because when it comes to the right of return, they are absolutely hardline, and I won't sign anything that would possibly give the idea that the right of the Palestinians to return to Israel would be maintaining one when the other. So that's how it was, and I realized eventually he did sign, and that I found very moving. A Jew with Israel is exactly that. There are the laws, and then there are the links. I've established this link, and I say, that's someone I trust. I'm not no better a Zionist than he is. I don't think that that Israelis who disagree with him are better Zionists either. You have to be quite clear about this. And I did support the Geneva Initiative with certain concern, and so on, not in order to have a blank page, not in order to say that everyone who's hostile to Israel and who nurture their anti-Semitism, even by saying, denying it and saying we're good people, you see, because I don't care about that. It's nothing to do with me. And that's precisely why I speak out about this matter on a Jewish radio station. My problem is no longer to provide guarantees for progressive discourse, pro-Islamic discourse. I've decided to really absolutely combat this mercilessly, tooth and nail. And I've decided to do that, and I shall continue to do this. As for the distress, I personally never believed in the topic of the new Jew. I don't think. How can I put this? Even in Zionism, the idea of a new Jew was a bit odd to me. This Canaanite idea, which Aleph Bet Yehoshua took to its extreme. I never really liked that warrior idea. I never believed in it. I never liked it. And now, as a result of Beni Levi, I would like Israel also to be the state where a study and observance should be possible for a large number of Jews. Because you can't have that in the same way, doubtless, as in, you can't do that in the same way in a large number of European countries. I think being Jewish means forgetting about this new mania, this belief of constantly believing in a new Jew. The distress I was referring to is a very special distress. It's distress facing proper awareness of an enemy who, instead of sewing a yellow star on your chest, puts something else on you. I belong to a generation which lived in the memory of what happened, who really imagined this. You could obviously only imagine it, not having lived it. And it could imagine how it would be face to face with this awful beast, with the horror, not thinking that it would have done better than its parents or its grandparents did in facing up to Hitler, but it wanted to understand, it wanted to give an idea. Psychologically speaking, that was pretty easy. But now that we see what's happening, this backlash, we have no voice now. In this discourse, people are just not really aware. And that's precisely what is triggering a certain number of attitudes, where we don't want to convince people. Given this backlash, there's no point trying to convince people, given this oblivion, this awful use of memory, taking memory and turning it against the Jews. This distress certainly can lead us to sidestep things. As for the Republic, well, this is an internal decision, one's own decision. Either we live in France because we are, or consider ourselves part of this history, or we decide not to do this. And I would say that this is an entirely understandable decision. It has its justification, its legitimacy, but you have to take it to its end, to its logical conclusion, because Israel exists. If the French Republic is nothing other than a framework which has no life, then there's no point. You can't be in France with a total mental reservation precisely because Israel does exist. And that attitude would no longer be justified. It could be justified as long as the Jews didn't have anywhere to go in order to be 100% Jewish. But if you want the comfort of France, it remains relatively comfortable still. You don't have suicide bombings. You don't have military service. You don't have the reserves duty, Miluim, which is major. We can say, well, we're here, but it's nothing to do with us. The Republic can go down in flames, and we don't care. We'll just look after our own matters. That's communitarism. Even those who stuck up things saying, Sharon, we're with you, and so on. There were people who, when the synagogues were burning, did realize that France as a nation, as a republic, was being affected. They realized that this mutation of France into a multicultural society was bad for France, because it would be bad for France and bad for the Jews, because a multicultural society means that France only exists in the present. When you say every day that Islam is the second religion in France, and it means France is a society, and we look at it now, but that's only the case now. It's never been true, because there are people who have died. Either you're in France because you are attached to the dead, those who have died, or you don't want to have anything to do with these people who've died anymore, so you have to come closer to your own dead. I'm attached to these dead people, to what Chesterton said, democracy is the right to vote for those who are alive, and tradition is the right to vote for the dead. There are Catholic public holidays in France. That's the right to vote for the dead, those who've died for the country, and that's perfectly normal. You take these high school students who say, well, we're not living in a secular countries. They only have public holidays, which are Catholic ones. In other words, they're not giving any place to history. We're only living in the present. There's no synchrony. There's no history. There's no chronicles. They're going to say, look, here we are, 60 million. Give us a place in history, and give our history a place in history. But what does that mean? I don't want that. That takes the nation and the French Republic and puts it in danger. That puts a certain link with France in danger. Link on the part of the Jews would then be in danger. And I think for the French, it's not a question of giving a total approval to France in the 21st century. Certainly not. But I do think that the French must benefit from the fact that they can, in fact, live elsewhere. They have to make up their minds. Thank you. We can take two more questions. You have a question here? Or here? Whichever microphone you want. Europe is going downhill. Didn't quite understand whether there's a major anti-Americanism in France, linking anti-Americanism to anti-Semitism. Well, that could be, how can I put this? One has the impression that Israel is the poodle of the Americans, and the anti-Americans, those who hate the U.S., aren't attacking the U.S., they're attacking the weak ally of the states, the poodle, Israel, the Jews. So it's a bit, what's happening to Europe? All nations are being diluted. It's very worrying, and all this could be linked up. There's a third point, that the Eastern countries, which the most nationalist, have now become the least anti-Semitic. Is all of this linked somehow? Yes, you're absolutely right to talk about Europe. Anti-Americanism, I did mention this briefly, but it's important to talk about Europe. France, obviously, is particularly exposed to anti-Semitism because France has this great tradition of radicality or of absolute politics, and in France there are several million Arabs. So Islamo-progression is a force. The Ramadan-José Bové alliance does represent something. But obviously the problem is a European one. And surveys that have been run by the European Union prove this. So here again, one has to think about this. It's not a resurgence of French anti-Semitism or a return to the European flare-up. It's the opposite. Europe has been based on one single oath. No longer, never again that. The idea being to be in opposition to itself, to totally mistrust and be utterly concerned about itself. And it's that discomfort, this disquiet that's provided a meaning to the European Union. So for the first time in its life, when it's establishing itself as a political entity, that it's really opposing not others but itself. All throughout its history, Europe was in opposition to conquering Islam, in opposition to whatever, Rome or Byzantium as opposition. And a series of oppositions constituted its European identity. And that's continuing now, and you can see that very, very clearly, and that gives that very paradoxical nature of the climate that we're currently experiencing. In other words, this same Europe that is a titan when it's not accepting of these Islamic demonstrations, when there are anti-Semitic demonstrations coming from itself, it's incredibly vigilant, but it's made to survive that, but politically it's impotent. No political entity lives by controlling itself. It lives through its links with others. When we had the Yugoslav wars, you had Germany in Croatia and France, the French in Serbia, and there was a blessing of a certain number of Jewish authorities because Serbia explained that Croatia had been Ustash, and they said, well, the Bukovar hospitals, the people there should just die out, and the Jews said very proudly, well, you look, we have avoided the return to the old demons of French nationalism facing German nationalism to the detriment of the city of Bukovar, Croats and Serbs and so on, in order to put a block on Serbian expansionism. But it did it by denying itself. And when you have a phenomenon like Haida coming along, Europe, which is both euphoric and worried, said, well, this is my mission. We're not going to allow that to happen. No, it's too much. It's not going to start again. And then the Austrian government is put under surveillance. And as soon as you have the slightest indication, which may, of course, be linked up to the old demons, Europe reacts as a single man. It can do that because it's not a Europe that's proud of itself. It's a Europe which is guilty. And that's the amazing thing. Europe, which is guilty of its own anti-Semitism, is incapable of reacting to contemporary anti-Semitism, first and foremost, because it doesn't come from itself, because that Europe doesn't want any enemies. It's even frightened of the idea that it can have enemies, which is a racist idea. It wants to be part of universal inclusionism. So tomorrow, if you have an indication of or a form of anti-Semitism that again can be ascribed to Europe, to France, then it will be the same people who will come out against these forms. There was a very striking dialogue on French TV a few months ago between Roger Kuckerman, president of CRIF, and Olivier Besançon, who was the head of the Trotskyist of the left wing, one of these factions of the very active, very vigorous left. And what did Kuckerman do? He referred to this new anti-Semitism. And Besançon managed to squeeze out a tear, possibly sincere. He said, how can you talk to me about anti-Semitism? I was born into politics at the time that there was the demonstration that came after the desecration of a grave in the Carpentras cemetery. So here we have a form of anti-Semitism coming from the circles of the people from North African backgrounds, the neighborhoods and so on. Do you think this can improve the situation? What do you feel about this? It's difficult, this one. I don't know. I've given you a number of conclusions, but also a number of questions. This is a very worrying phenomenon. It's also a very surprising one at the same time. But what I can say to you is that the attitude of the President of the Republic has triggered criticisms in France, very symptomatic attacks by the lead newspaper, Le Monde. In other words, there has been reference made to a kind of contradiction in a policy which, on the one hand, denounced the war in Iraq and at the same time instituted a law hardening the conditions of secularism, as if in one instance they were going towards Islam and in another case, the other case, they were stigmatizing Islam. This is a very worrying attitude. How can I put this? It's not so much the policy that people should worry about, but rather the doxa and the views of those who pursue them. That's what makes it so different from previously what the case was. Institutionally speaking, there's no problem whatsoever. No problem in terms of people's work, professions and so on. The state is holding fast. It's steadfast. And people may be, or the authorities may be, affected or influenced by certain traditions. Okay, there's the tradition of the Quai d'Orsay, the French Foreign Office. France is traditionally pro-Arab policy and so on. But what is really bad is that a newspaper like Le Monde can see a contradiction between two totally different political gestures. In one case, the French government thought that the war in Iraq wasn't legitimate and was providing more, or coming up with more problems and solutions. That was a perfectly logical, tenable argument. And on the one hand, it wanted to tackle an Islamist challenge. That's a difference. Something else is not only legitimate, but it's absolutely necessary. So there's this vision of the world of the other world people. And this is something which is really utterly dominant, and it divides reality into two poles, the dominant and the dominated. You always have to be on the side of the dominated against the dominant. So you have to be against the American dominance in Iraq, and you have to, in France, be against the Republican dominant persons in favor of those who are oppressed. What I'm afraid of, in any case, is that the measures adopted today by the French government might perhaps be a prelude to a rehabilitation of schools as a place of transmission. Now, that means that I have to quickly open a parenthesis, a new area of thought here, but I close it immediately almost. As I said before, we are living or experiencing accelerated mutation of the French nation into a society. The nation is the presence of a past. Society is omnipotent present. And this change, this mutation, this transformation is going on at the school now. Schools are less and less governed by the paradigm of transmission by the dead. Rather, it's governed by the paradigm of communication. People communicate, they dialogue. And if you continue along these lines of intersubjective dialogue, intercultural dialogue, then France will continue to lose the concept of itself, and one day or another, obviously, it will be confronted by this problem of Islamic demands saying we are the second biggest religion in France, and France will have forgotten, will have lost all its necessary resources in the meanwhile with which it could have replied. It has responded through this law, but if that response is not followed by a rehabilitation of schools as the place of transmission, then in 10 years we'll have to have another date for another new challenge. And I'm really afraid that at that point, France will have become totally incapable of responding. I really must thank agree. I really must conclude. I really want very profoundly to thank Alain Finkielkraut, who has not only given a remarkable address, but who has replied brilliantly for 3/4 of an hour, 2 questions, and I really think we must thank him very warmly. And I'd also like to thank all the members of the teams from the Vidal Sassoon Center for organizing this wonderful evening. Thank you very much.